Hey everyone, welcome to another interview. I am very excited today to have Scott Sunquist with me, joining me from over in the US of A. For those who don't know, Scott is the Dean of the School of Intercultural Studies and the Professor of World Christianity in the School of Intercultural Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. He previously taught at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and before that Trinity Theological College in the Republic of Singapore, where he and his wife Nancy also served as missionaries. He's the author of a number of excellent books, including The Unexpected Christian Century, The Reversal and Transformation of Global Christianity, 1900 to 2000, Understanding Christian Mission, Participation in Suffering and Glory, and the 3-volume History of the World Christian Movement, which he co-authored with Dale Irvin. Today, however, we are talking about his recent work, Explorations in Asian Christianity, History, Theology, and Mission, which I encourage everyone to check out. For some more encouragement, we're going to ask some questions. So Scott, welcome along.
Thank you. Good to be here, or good to be there, wherever you are.
Yes. Wherever we are in the world, we are together. So my first question really is just a bit broad. As someone who has spent quite a lot of time studying the past, studying history and writing on it, I want to borrow a title from Rowan Williams and just ask, why study the past?
Yeah, I came to a conclusion that history is important because as my father began to develop dementia, he, in a sense, lost who he was. He lost his identity. And I think that's why we need to do history well, because we are what we remember. If you've lost your memory completely, you're not that person. So you are how you remember what's happened in the past. And so the retelling of history, and we have to keep rewriting history from different contexts and everything. It's an ongoing process. It's dynamic. Hopefully, we're kind of constantly recentering ourselves who we really are. And as Christians in the global church, that means we have to have those stories told from different perspectives around the world, as well as people who can kind of try to put the whole thing together as a major narrative. But the telling of history is something that has to be continually done. It's done in community, in different contexts, and at different times and places. And so it's been a joy of mine in the last 25 or 30 years to be telling that story and to reading the way people have told the stories in the past and to see how different things are today. So history is, in a sense, gives us our identity.
That's great. Thank you. And it's really interesting how you're right, that comes through finding the new voices or rediscovering old voices that may have been overlooked. And I think that comes through very strongly in the book. So establishing the why, maybe we can explore the how. You have a great chapter in the book, Missio Dei, Christian History Envisioned as Cruciform Apostolicity. Yeah. You offer a way of studying Christian history as maybe a corrective to some past and present processes. The history of Christianity, you write, quote, must be taught as a center-set religion with the perception of the two eyes of the cruciform and apostolic church. Could you speak a little to what the study of history gains from this cruciform and apostolic focus?
Yeah. Let me tell a little bit of story that I tell in the book, and then you won't have to read this one page. The reason I came up with this is I was asked to teach about the history of Christianity in China, where they had not been studying church history. They had not been studying Christian history for a whole generation and a half. They've been studying, most history is economically driven. And so they had Marxist, Maoist interpretations of history. And then they all of a sudden had a huge number of people interested in studying the history of Christianity because they began to uncover things and go through their files and libraries and say, oh my gracious, all of these terms for music, for physics, for mathematics, for religions have been brought to us by missionaries. And they have given us these terms. Why did they? So as they began to uncover that, they started to study the history of Christianity, and they couldn't explain why certain things happened. For example, why would these people come to China? Why would they come and, wives and children were dying and they continued to stay here and serve? What was motivating them? And so at that time, the only way I could explain it is that to understand what Christianity is centered on or what's founded on, and that's on the cross of Christ or the humiliation of God coming to us. And so I told a story. I said, well, what do you see on a church that kind of identifies its center? And only 2 people out of the 30 or 40 there knew what you would see on a church. I mean, this was a Maoist, Marxist university. And so they said a cross. And I said, well, what does that mean? And nobody knew. So I had to kind of tell the story of what the cross means And that opened up for them what they should look for as they're studying the history of Christianity. Now, to give an example of a different kind of history, if you're studying the history of a bank, or my son is an accountant, the history of an accounting firm, you would ask different questions. You'd want to know about interest rates, policies for investments, these sort of things. You wouldn't ask about apostolicity. But if you're studying Christianity, you study it according to what's essential in its DNA. And I think historically, as well as theologically, you would say, this is getting at the core of what Christianity is about. It's cruciform. Nobody would have dreamed of developing a religion based on humiliation and suffering and death and defeat. And then secondly, it is missionary. It's apostolic. Very few religions are really apostolic. Most religions in the history of humanity have been cultic or ethnic or nationalistic and so forth. They reinforce the identity of a people. But this just completely broke out. And it was supposed to be for everybody. So you have the concept of panta ethne, or every ethnic group and everything, which, and before then, is unique. There's something similar in Judaism, but that's really coming here and you're going to observe it, but it's not this going out thing. So those are two essential elements, I think, of Christianity that help for a historian. If you're looking for those things, then you can say, oh my gracious, what are they doing over here? They completely forgot who they were. They were picking up weapons, they were slaughtering each other. And so you can provide a critique of history, which I think we have to do. We don't just say, oh, that's what happened, it must be okay. We take a look at it and we can evaluate certain Christian histories as being really eccentric, off-center.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think maybe following that, I can imagine this would influence or how you analyze or speak of Christian mission today. Can you feel like you can apply this to more contemporary discussions of missionary practice? Oh,
yeah, I think we have to do it all the time. I mean, there's a lot of missionary work which deserves a strong critique, but there are other elements we need to lift up and say, well, they may not be doing it well, but look at what they're doing. There was an excellent political science essay that came out about 3 years ago by Robert Woodbury, where he identified, it was a phenomenal study of years and millions of dollars and scholars all over the world, drilling down at different communities or counties throughout Africa and Asia and Latin America to find out what missionaries were serving there, what were they doing, and now in the 21st century, is there any residual impact from just their presence being there? And he could identify that there was an impact simply by missionaries being there, planting churches, setting up schools or clinics. There's an impact, and the impact can be measured in terms of infant mortality rate, literacy rate, a basic annual income. It may be a small difference, but their presence there showed that something about this humility and work and the work that they were doing has had an impact. So when we study the history as well as the contemporary work of missionaries, I think we need to hold up sort of a gauge and say, how are we doing? And as we prepare people here at Fuller to go out, we want to point out these things. There's been some really bad work in the past, and look, we don't want you to be a part of that history. So you have the opportunity to say, okay, I've learned from that. Things have changed, but still there's certain principles, guidelines, ways of thinking that we want to inculcate.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. So reading through the book, it becomes clear that the birth and transmission of Asian Christianity is more complex than like west to east, as it might be commonly understood. For instance, you write about the early flourishing of Christianity in Persia, and that there were educational institutions and they were sending out missionaries. Right. You also talk about Christian teaching coming to Korea, thanks to Korean emissaries who would go to China to seek out new Confucian teaching and brought back translated Christian writings. I was wondering whether you could expand a little on this multi-directional, multi-layered history of the spread of Christianity.
Yeah, and again, goes back to our first question of, who tells the story and the narrative. Because we've had a narrative that's basically been Euro-American, we've seen everything from that perspective. We just looked at that. So I'll give you a visual for this, okay? We used to think it was this, but it's really always been this, from the very beginning. I have a sentence, I think, in The Unexpected Christian Century where I say something like, Christianity was born at the borderland of two empires and at the confluence of three continents. And I think that's fascinating to think about, that Jesus was born there in between two empires, because that area of Syria, the Syrian area for the Roman Empire, was constantly going back and forth between the Persians and the Romans. And so there is that influence from Asia and Europe that's right there in Palestine. But then also you have a lot of African influence there. So you have these three continents, coming together there. And Christianity immediately spread. If you were to kind of look down, you could see that it spread into Persia more than to Europe at first, because Europe was very oppressive about Christianity, whereas the Persians, the Parthians, they were fairly pluralistic, sort of like the Mongols. They were kind of an inclusivist, empire. And then in Africa, you had people that were very attracted to these teachings. And even today, a lot of the teachings of the Old Testament and of Christ, there's much more of an elective affinity, we might say, than certainly in the secular West or in a lot of other religious backgrounds. And so from the very beginning, it was moving out like that. And so you had Asians, West Asians, bringing the faith to East Asians. But then if we take a look, we spin ahead about 14 centuries, we can see that there were Portuguese in South India that were bringing the gospel down to East Africa. And even to this day, in places like Mozambique, Madagascar, you'll find Indian influences as well as Portuguese influences in East Africa. And we haven't even begun to talk about migrations. We used to think about the spread of Christianity by missionaries going here, missionaries going there. But maybe half or maybe even most of the spread of Christianity has been a matter of people moving, the pull and the push forces of economics, disease, war, all these things are pushing and pulling. I live in Southern California, and we just have this amazing movement of Chinese to the area now, and they're building huge numbers of buildings. And so we are beginning to teach in Chinese at Fuller Seminary starting this next spring. And it's not because we're sending missionaries or they're sending missionaries here. It's just they're all coming here. And so we have to be attentive to migration as a way of explaining the development of Christianity.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's a really broadens the picture of it quite well. So having explored this movement of Christianity throughout Asia and the rest of the world in the case of the history of the world Christian movement, I have an important question. As someone who is in Southern California, only a couple of bus rides away from LA, if you're taking a story or an event or an individual from your studies, from your different works, but you're like, this person needs a movie. We're talking a big blockbuster, the full for your consideration Academy treatment. We're gonna do it right. What do you think needs to be a movie for the people?
Well, I could talk about the earlier book, The Unexpected Christian Century, where I did 20 biographies.
Okay, yeah. And
I think any one of them would be great. I think I have it here. I hate it when people do this to say, let me quote for myself, okay?
Do it.
I couldn't have said it better myself. As a matter of fact, I didn't say it myself. But, you've got people in here like, let me get to the Latin American section. Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable the influence of some of these people from Latin America, not only Gustavo Gutierrez, but Dom Helder Camara. I mean, the impact of this gentleman globally in the church, he's been a great inspiration. And Oscar Romero, I mean, it's just amazing. John Sung, I think the American Society of Church History is going to do a special thing on John Sung, this great evangelist. And these are famous people that people know about and had a great impact. But then there are people that you wouldn't hear about if you didn't have a copy of the Dictionary of Asian Christianity. And that's Ditt, D-I-T-T. That's his whole name. We don't have anything else. He was illiterate. And he was up in the borders today of Pakistan and India, started a great people movement because he heard about missionaries telling this story about God that he wanted to know a little bit about. So he went and he sat for 2 or 3 weeks listening to the missionaries tell the stories. And he would ask questions. And as most people who are pre-literate, he had a great memory. So he remembered all the stories about Jesus. He went back to his village, and 2 weeks later, he brought like 30 or 40 people to the missionaries and said, we all want to be baptized. Now, that's the kind of thing that caused me to think differently about Christianity. And this led into the thesis of the Unexpected Christian Century, and that's that we really got it wrong because of Christendom and assuming that Christianity the goal of Christianity is for nations to be converted and for laws to all become more Christian and for military to be more, preventative than active kind of thing. We assumed that was what was going to happen. Eventually, the emperor would become a Christian. And then we have these Christian emperors and presidents in countries and prime ministers who are Christian, and we're embarrassed. I wish he wouldn't call himself a Christian, because it's never going to be a Jesus figure leading a country. His kingdom is not of this world. And so the power and the influence really is from the margins. It's from people. And we say this sort of, we like, liberation phrases and so forth, but, it's actually true. The power of the gospel comes through humiliation. It comes through weakness. It comes through defeat. And it doesn't come through getting an earned PhD and writing lots of books. The people that have the great influence are people like Dit. Dit started a whole people movement where tens of thousands of people came to faith in Christ, and you have this large church among his people group. John Sung had all this education. He, I think, in 4 or 5 years earned a bachelor's, master's, and PhD at Ohio State University in chemistry, and that's when he didn't know English very well. He came as an international student from China. His English was very poor, and immediately, he's just a genius, and was offered jobs in Germany to help develop ballistics and explosives for Hitler. And he turned that down. Also, he said, "Oh no, wait! I came to the United States to study to be a pastor." So he went to Union in New York because he figured that was the best seminary in the world. No comment. And at that time, he had this great conversion by a Pentecostal female evangelist of 15 years old in Harlem. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This actually happened. And he came back and started singing songs. They thought he was insane. And they put him in an insane asylum, and he just read through the Bible over and over again. And by the time he got out, and then he went back to China, he threw out, all of his material. He just kept his PhD as a good Chinese and says, "Here, Father, here's my earned doctorate." Gave it to him. And then he became an evangelist. And he said, the heck with all that education, and he just preached and had probably the greatest impact maybe of any Asian leader so far in the history of Christianity. So anyway, I can talk about a lot of those people, but there are a number, and it doesn't come out of very few of them would be bishops or popes. They're in a sense marginal people, had this phenomenal impact. And that's why, to go back to your first question, I think it's important to study the history of Christianity with those two lenses.
Yeah, great. Thank you for those really exciting stories that I'm sure others will be wanting to learn more about. So Unexpected Christian Century, go pick it up. So an important contribution in this book is your discussion on how the world Christian perspective in contemporary church history can shape theology. Could you perhaps give us a short insight into this section and share with us some indicators of a theology shaped by the questions and experiences of world Christianity?
Yeah. This is something very interesting. I was asked to write this essay for Peter Fahn's Festschrift, and in doing it, I moved from just saying, we've got to do theology differently in light of this global church, this world Christian movement, but also maybe even especially we have to do ethics differently. In other words, if we're all one human family and the church is an ecumenical global church, then we can't just sort of siphon things off and say, oh, well, because of your context, that's we understand things. Because there are deeper truths here that run through the human condition. So an example of this would be, what do you do with ancestors? What do you do with the dead? And I'm going to tell you a story which indicated for me that we have sort of seared part of our human anatomy in the brain because of secularization. I had somewhat of a tragedy in my family. My sister and her daughter died in a boating accident. It was very difficult. I just was depressed for a long time. And I was telling the story to 4 Presbyterian pastors. Now, these are Presbyterians, not Pentecostal, okay? And I'm telling the story of where I was talking to my niece, and she said, my mommy came to me in a dream. I said, really? What happened, Katie? And she said, she stroked my hair and she said, I'm okay, Katie. You are so beautiful. Katie, you are so beautiful. And I said, what else did she say to you? That's all. Now, I told this story to these 4 Presbyterian pastors, And none of them said, wow, that's amazing. They all said, oh, yeah, that happens all the time. So it happens all the time. They've done funerals. They counsel people who died. Now, where are the ancestors? If you told that story in Africa, everybody could tell you 20 or 30 other stories of ancestors coming and speaking to them that are being connected. If you told it in Thailand or among Chinese, they may have different views of the ancestors, but you have to develop a theology, a global world theology that deals with ancestors. Is there a period of time they can communicate? Do they communicate? In the Roman Catholic Church, this may be a little bit easier because of the tradition of saints. But in Protestantism and in the West, we don't want to talk about that. We don't know how to deal with it. Africans know how to deal with it. And most people who come from nature religions, what we used to call animist faiths in the past, they understand this thing completely. I was talking to a friend in Chiang Mai, Thailand, who was working on one of the first, I think, systematic theologies written in Thai for the Thai church. And I said, oh, that sounds fascinating. And I'm immediately thinking, as a missionary coming there in this foreign culture, the thing that strikes you about being in Thailand are spirit houses. They're everywhere. Everybody has a spirit house outside. Every business has a spirit house. And the reason for those spirit houses is you've got to make sure you take care of the spirits so they don't bother you. Mm-hmm. And so I said, oh, that's a fascinating spirit. How are you going to deal with spirits? And he says, what do you mean? Well, you're doing a systematic theology in Thailand, so what do you do with spirits? Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Well, he hadn't thought of it because all of his theological study was in the West. Mm. So if you're going to allow world Christianity to influence how we do theology and how we do ethics, you've got to deal with the spirits. You've got to deal with the ancestors. You have to deal with family and family systems and cultures that make sense in different places. And a lot of these issues we need to learn, I think, a lot from Africans, because for them, they understand the world of the Bible a little bit easier than we do. So we're going to have to be discipled, and some, I think, by African theologians a lot, and probably South Asian theologians.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's some fascinating questions to keep wrestling with.
Well, you were asking the questions, so they must, you're the fascinating questions. I'm just answering them.
Well, you posed some questions within the answer. Okay. I felt, yeah. So
I'll accept it.
But we're both great. So discussions of world Christianity inevitably find themselves in questions of unity. You make a constructive offering first with the imagery of a plant, this kind of same genotype, but expressed in a variety of phenotypes, which is like the same plant, but different expressions shaped by environment and epigenetic factors. And later, we have the following passage, which identifies 5 elements that give the church in each context a common story and common family identity. And I'll just read this quote. Christian coherence is found in that Christians, in all their diverse beliefs and practices, find their identity in Jesus Christ, look to the scriptures to explain who he is and who they are to be, as they gather to remember, honor, and spread the teachings and practices that Jesus commends. And they are aware that God is somehow active through his Spirit in what they do and say. Having spent a decent length of time exploring world Christian history and writing on missiology, what are some big issues or maybe problems that tend to come up in conversations around unity? And how does your kind of image and conception help?
Yeah, it was one of those moments when I was writing out in this cabin in Colorado. I remember very clearly, how in the world am I going to explain this in ways that get beyond the impasse of either we have many different Christianities, or we all just have at least common denominator Christianity, like we all believe in God and that Jesus is important, something like that. So how do we get beyond that to name brand Christianity that's about Jesus and allows for these different expressions? And I really like that biological image, because that goes back to 10th grade science. I remember genotype and phenotype. Can you believe that? So all your biology teachers out there, they don't forget everything. But I think it's true that we have to admit, if it's Christianity, there's something essential to the DNA that's going to be the same everywhere you go. And there'll be something that if somebody says something, you know what? That's not really Christianity. That's similar to Christianity, but that's not Christianity anymore. If once it's Jesus and then Mary's also God, I think, well, that's a little bit something different there. but it can have very different expressions so that you can include a group of Muslim believers, followers of Esau, within a mosque, because you don't have to build a Christian church or cathedral with a cross on the outside to worship. That's not a part of the essential DNA. But that looks very different when the women have their faces covered and the men and women worship separately, as they do in many places in the world. And so it takes on the phenotype, and that's exactly what happens in a plant. It takes on its local culture, and the soil, the light, and atmosphere will have a different expression in its genetic structure. So to go back to your question, that's just kind of expanding on what the image makes. To go back to your question, I think that most everywhere in the world, the problem is understanding cultures. Whether that be, warfare today and trade, it's a lack of trust in cultures. And so in Christianity, we will see divisions in churches in North America, and I'm assuming in Australia, that are rooted very much in cultural assumptions, where culture is both different places, but it's also different time. Mm-hmm. And so we have churches that culturally are in the 1950s, and 21st century young people, they don't understand that culture at all. When you talk about the Gloria Patri, they say, huh? And they don't want anything to do with it. So that is a cultural difference from time. So some of the biggest divisions have to do with cultures and cultural assumptions. But as you probably know, and probably all of our listeners know, the two big divisions in Christianity that are very difficult have to do with order and sacraments. How do you order the church? Who is to be ordained? Who can baptize? Who can do the sacraments? Who can preach? Do you allow women in the pulpit? Do you allow people who don't have theological training in the pulpit? Those are the things that really divide us and keep us apart. I'm working on a book right now called A Guide to the Church for Those Who Don't Do Church. And I'm absolutely committed to this sort of ecumenical vision of bringing people together. And so I have to write in ways that are very pointed about what sacraments are about, with avoiding language of symbol or real presence, but talking about obedience and participating in Christ, and use this sort of language, and then admit at the end, everybody is now going to have to read the specifics of their understanding in this, but we all need to start with this foundation or this core if we're going to understand what a worship service is about. And so I guess because of my training back at Princeton in the grand tradition of John Mackay, I continue to see John 17, the high priestly prayer of Jesus, as essential in mission, Christian witness, and in Christian life. And so I will constantly, push against the kind of things that separate people of the same genotype, and help them to be gracious and kind and magnanimous in our relations.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So another excellent chapter in the book is 4 Theorists, 3 Selves, 2 Countries, 1 Goal. You explore missionary practice in Korea and China. The main thing I want to ask is, you make a kind of fascinating point near the end of the chapter. So how does the comparative mission practices in Korea and China blur traditional conservative or liberal distinctions?
Yeah, this is why history is important, because we get our nice, comfortable assumptions about what is true Christianity. We find ourselves more left-leaning and more right-leaning. And then all of a sudden you meet somebody who is a really conservative missionary, and that's Samuel Austin Moffat, whose sons went to Wheaton, at that time it was Wheaton College, and was fighting against modernism. And then he says something as strange as, we need to understand that the Tonghaks, there was a Tonghak rebellion in Korea at the end of the 19th century. We have to understand these Tonghaks are more sinned against than sinners. Now, that's unbelievable. They were a liberation movement trying to free from the oppression of the Chinese, the Russians, the Japanese. The Koreans were constantly being oppressed. And so he is working in this region out in the frontiers of North Korea, present-day suburbs of Pyongyang. And he comes in contact with these Tonghaks, and they talk together, and they find they have a lot in common. They hate this oppression. They care for the poor. And as a missionary, he just naturally cares for the poor and can't stand to see people diseased and can't stand. So he wants to bring in medical care. And so he understands their frustration. And so he writes back to the mission board in New York City, we need to be understanding that these people are not so much sinners as sinned against, classic liberation theology language. And then he ends up setting up this seminary in Pyongyang, which then later had to migrate to South Korea. But within about 5 years, he's training about 1,000 people a year in this place where they come together for a month, and then they go back to the villages and they teach the Gospel of John, and they come back after harvest season. They get training for a month, and they go out and they teach Exodus and 1 Corinthians in the villages, and they come back. It's an amazing program that he had, distance learning, in the late 19th, early 20th century. And when he does that, he is not aware that the people that are working right in his house, his servants and his cook, are involved in this liberation movement against the Japanese. And so this liberationist document that is printed in North Korea, part of the early documents calling people to come together to protest against the Japanese were printed in his house. And he didn't even know it. And so he's taken into prison, he's arrested, and he really doesn't know what's going on, what this is about. People in Seoul know about what's happened before he knows there, because he's just focused on, we're just teaching the Bible kind of thing. So, what do you do with something like that? Well, you say, he was really teaching the gospel, and they heard it. The poor, the oppressed, they understood exactly what he was saying. Blessed are the poor, and they knew they were blessed, and they took it up. And he actually said explicitly, these Tonghaks liberationists, who were militant people, they were taking up arms to fight. And he said, he allowed them to use their assembly hall, only he says, please don't take up arms and kill people. Yeah. But you can use our place for your gathering, just, please don't kill people, I'll feel badly about it. So that's an example. There are many other examples like this, but I think it's helpful for us, if you're very evangelical or fundamentalist, you say, this is a natural outcome of just preaching the, quote, pure gospel. And if you're more liberationist and liberal, you say, this comes from really lifting up Jesus. You can see these kind of things. You can expect these kind of things. And that's the power of transformation that will take place.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I found, looking at Moffat was particularly interesting, and some wild stories in there. So another reason to check out the book, everyone. So in your section on missiology, you offer an introductory theology for mission and migration. And we talked about migration briefly before, and how that's affecting how things are being done at Fuller. This is full of powerful insights, this section. However, we'll move past them because people need to buy the book. What I want to ask is what spurred your desire to write about migration from a missiological perspective? And what's maybe one kind of concrete challenge that you would really want to lay at the feet of our listeners from your time developing this chapter? Yeah,
it's I think many of these chapters were not written by choice, but by coercion. I was asked to do some lectures on migration in Sabah, which is North Borneo, East Malaysia. And so in preparing for that, I said I better do a little bit of research about ethnic makeup, migration in Kota Kinabalu and in East Malaysia. And it was overwhelming. I could not believe what I discovered in terms of indigenous peoples moving to the city, Chinese coming over, a few Indians coming over from West Malaysia, and then Indonesian Muslims coming up from the south, from the islands in the south, and then Filipino Muslims trying to escape all the violence in the Philippines to the good life in East Malaysia. And so I could not believe it. And then I was involved in a Bible study in a house of a preacher, a Chinese preacher, where he had like 55 or 60 people in his living room for dinner. They had him over every week, like 60 Chinese who were studying at the University of Malaya in Kota Kinabalu. And they were doing Bible studies. And many of them will stay there because they get a good education and they get a job. So there's a struggle with the Malaysian government of keeping out the Chinese, but the Chinese bring money and they come to the school, bringing in more Muslims because they're trying to Islamicize East Malaysia, which is more Christian than Muslim, but Malaysia is basically a Muslim country. So you have these internal governmental, issues going on. So when I studied all that, and then I remembered my good friend Jihu Hansels had done an excellent job on globalization and migration. and I went back and looked at some of his themes there, I began to see, yes, this is really important, and it's important for Kota Kinabalu, it's important for Pittsburgh, it's important for LA. And so I'm not basically a migration specialist, but I have benefited from people like Jihu and others who've been writing in this area. And then by studying and getting some really helpful response from the people over there, I found a pastor who was working in Kuala Lumpur in KL in West Malaysia. And he talked about the number of Vietnamese that were coming down to work in Kuala Lumpur. I said, really? So he was working with these people, helping to plant churches, helping them to learn Bahasa Malay, helping them to get apartments and everything, get jobs. And then he sent a lawyer friend of his back to Vietnam to work with some of these to prepare them for coming. So it's just an amazing thing of this back and forth. So again, it's more like this, it's not this. So it wasn't just people, migrants coming here, but there's always reverse migration, and there's always relationships that are much more dynamic and rich. So I was very fortunate to learn from these Malaysians the creative things that they were doing, and was able to bring that back to some of our churches here in LA as ways of being attentive to the smells when you'd walk down the street, to the signs on the road, the signs on the stores, and then to begin to find connections with those communities.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. It is a really excellent and intriguing chapter that you're going to probably launch the beginning of a lot more work that needs to be done. So a final broader question, because people will be soon finishing the interview and heading over to Book Depository or Amazon.com to buy the book and rate it 5 stars and do all those good things. But assuming that most of the people listening to this will be Christians in the West, some ordained, some not, why should they explore Asian Christianity? Now, I'm sure by all these answers have sold them, but here's just one last pitch. Why should you? Why should I explore Asian Christianity?
Yeah, there are a number of reasons. One is Asia is just really big. I mean, it's just huge, and the classic empires are in decline. So Asia's economic empire is just huge. China, India, we know about Japan and Korea. They're struggling now, but China is just amazing. Here's an example. There was a mission conference in Ethiopia about a year ago, and it was for missionaries working throughout Africa. And so what languages did they translate into? Well, they translated into everything into English. So if you're in Kikuyu, it'd be in English. And they did everything in Korean, which you might say, oh, yeah, that's right. There's a lot of Koreans now. Yeah, okay. And then another European language, I can't remember if it's Portuguese or French, and Chinese, because there were tens, if not hundreds, of Chinese missionaries working in Africa. Now, we owe it to Asia to study their history and to be able to connect and help teach some of the lessons, the mistakes that we've made in the past, but also to pay attention to learn from them about what Christianity is about, because we forgot. It's sort of like the image I have is having really thick gloves and a hat and muffs on, and you can't really sense much because Christendom did that to us. It prevented us from really sensing some of the power of the gospel and of Christianity because of this Christendom kind of assumptions. But when we take those things off and everything, we really begin to experience and hear and smell and taste Christianity from around the world. I think it's good and healthy and wholesome for us, but also, vice versa. Another reason for this is because, there are just Asians everywhere. And the Chinese are building there's this huge building boom in downtown LA now. I am overwhelmed. There have been 2 or 3 big buildings. I go to Hollywood Presbyterian Church. I go down. Oh my gosh, that building wasn't there, and now it's blocking the view when I get off the exit here. And look at this new one going up over here. And there was an article that most of these are built by Chinese. Now, I think it's important for us to pay attention to all cultures in the world, but when they're right here in our backyard, it's a matter of servanthood, to study and to learn, and then to be able to connect. I have a friend who pastors a church in Queens, New York, and I was the mission guy at Pittsburgh Seminary, so he invited me to come up and talk about what they should do in Queens, New York, how they should be involved in global mission. And so I said, well, I think for you to be involved in global mission, you should just stay here. So what are we talking about? I said, look at those apartment buildings. There's 4 of these massive apartment buildings, 40, 50 stories. Who lives there? And they say, oh, it used to be, the Portuguese and Southern Europeans, but now it's the Russians. The Russians. I said, well, you should have some church members move over in that apartment building and start learning Russian. They come in here, they're going to have needs, have connections, because Queens is the world. Like all the world comes to Queens, then they find other places to go. Some go to Toronto, some go to Vancouver, and some come to LA. But Queens is the world. And so it would be very helpful. And this guy's church has like 73 nationalities in the church. So if they're all coming there, we need to be attentive to these movements and then find ways of connecting, both for our sake as well as for the sake of these others. But I would stand by my first statement. Asia's really big.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, people really should go check out the book, Explorations in Asian Christianity, out through IVP Academic as part of the Missiological Engagement series. Scott, is there anything else you want to plug, draw people's attention to, stuff you've got coming up down the line? Anything you want to make mention of?
Yeah, I think you all need to read John Flett's book.
Yes.
And then, wait, there's another book that just came out in our other series. It's by Bryant Myers. Okay, I'm gonna go over here and get this book because it's so good that it's going to probably get all kinds of awards. And you heard it first here.
All right, here we go. We got that sneak peek, that early preview that you can only get in interviews such as this. That's why you stick around. Subscribe to the channel.
Okay, here it is. Engaging Globalization. Subtitle: The Poor, Christian Mission, and Our Hyper-Connected World. Bryant Myers wrote the book, Walking with the Poor, which I think is the standard book for people working in the areas of development in the world. That is the second most sold book on Orbis Books after David Bosch's Transforming Mission. And I think this is the next thing that's going to be do real well, because he understands globalization so well and challenges us. We have not, as Christians, really studied globalization to provide a critique as well as a support. And the church, he says, the church in the 19th century caught up with empires and colonization. There were places and times where the church pushed back and says, no, slavery is not a part of what the church should be about. And it's because of Christians that this became an issue in that first era of globalization. Now, this new globalization of the 21st century needs that kind of critique. And if I were you, I'd invite him on.
There you go. We've got it. Now we just got to try to get right. So thank you for that, Scott. That's excellent. You'd love to come away with some extra work to do. So thank you, Scott, very much for your time today. People check out the book and Scott's other works because it's also excellent. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. All right, bye.